Canada charges us 250% for our milk product and other product, and a tremendous tariff on lumber and things as such. And yet we don't need their lumber. We have more lumber than they do.
It sounded powerful on stage, the idea that the United States could cut reliance on Canadian lumber and stand completely on its own. But the moment that message turned into real policy, the impact wasn't political. It was immediate, economic, and impossible to ignore. Tariffs didn't just sit in government documents. They flowed straight into supply chains, hit sawmills, slowed construction sites, and quietly pushed up the cost of building a home. By late 2025 into 2026, layered duties on Canadian softwood, anti-dumping, countervailing, and additional national security tariffs drove total rates into the 35 to 45% range in some cases. That didn't just protect domestic producers, it destabilized one of the most critical inputs in the entire housing market. Because the truth is simple, the U.S. doesn't import lumber by choice, it imports it because it has to.
Roughly 30% of America's lumber demand is met through imports, and Canada dominates that share, supplying up to 80% in many years. So when tariffs hit Canadian wood, they don't target a side player, they hit the core of the system. And even in a best-case scenario, with every American mill running at full capacity, the country still can't fully close the gap. That shortfall shows up where it hurts most, in rising home prices, delayed construction, and a housing market under pressure. Because lumber isn't optional. It's the backbone of every house, every neighborhood, every expansion plan. And when its cost surges, the entire dream built on top of it becomes more expensive, slower, and harder to reach.
Builders felt the shock almost instantly. The moment tariffs pushed up the landed cost of Canadian lumber, even small duty increases started adding tens of dollars per thousand board feet. And when you scale that across an entire home, it quickly turns into thousands of dollars in extra cost. Suddenly, projects that made sense on paper were going over budget, forcing developers into a tough choice: raise prices or walk away. And the numbers are hard to ignore. Housing analysts have warned that a few $100 increase per thousand board feet can add $7,500 to over $10,000 to a typical home. That doesn't stay in spreadsheets. It shows up in higher mortgages, rising rents, and fewer people who can actually afford to buy. So a policy meant to protect American industry started behaving like something else entirely: a hidden tax on construction, quietly inflating costs at every stage, from raw timber to finished homes. And the ripple effect goes even further, feeding into inflation and tightening the entire housing market. Meanwhile, the idea that tariffs would spark a rapid surge in U.S.
production ran into reality. The industry isn't sitting idle. It's already stretched, limited by labor shortages, regulations, aging mills, and the long timelines needed to expand capacity. You can impose tariffs overnight, but you can't build new supply chains overnight, and that gap creates real pressure. Demand keeps moving, but supply can't catch up fast enough. And while the U.S. was dealing with that strain, Canada took a different path. Instead of escalating, it adapted, quietly shifting strategy, reducing its reliance on the U.S., and expanding into Asia, Europe, and new global markets. What once looked like a setback started turning into an opportunity as Canadian producers diversified, invested, and rewired their export model. And as those new channels opened, something unexpected began to unfold. Canada's position in the global lumber market didn't shrink, it evolved. As U.S. demand became more uncertain, countries like Japan stepped in, and fast-growing regions across Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and Europe began taking larger volumes of Canadian timber. It wasn't just about availability, it was about trust. Canada's reputation for sustainable forestry and consistent quality suddenly became a major advantage in a world focused on environmental standards and reliable supply chains. But back in North America, the contrast was becoming impossible to ignore. While Canada expanded outward, the United States was dealing with the internal weight of its own policy, rising costs, tightening supply, and a construction sector under real pressure. Developers started delaying projects, Budgets became unpredictable, and builders were forced to constantly recalculate in a market where prices were shifting not just from supply and demand, but from policy decisions. And that's where the story flips. The goal was simple: reduce imports, boost domestic production, protect jobs. But the reality proved far more complex. Cutting off a major supplier didn't remove dependence. It reshaped it into something harder to control. And this wasn't a new fight either. The US-Canada lumber dispute has been running since the 1980s, evolving through cycles of agreements, tensions, and legal battles. And by 2026, it had become more than just a trade issue. It was a real-world case study of how policy collides with economic reality. Because once tariffs climbed past 35%, and in some cases toward 45%, the pressure didn't stop at the border. It spread deep into supply chains. And the numbers told a different story than the one promised. Instead of a surge in U.S. production, the industry hit its limits. Mills already near capacity, labor shortages unresolved, and expansion requiring years and billions in investment. That gap between ambition and reality showed up clearly in housing. Even a 1% rise in lumber prices can add over $1,000 to a new home. And when prices surged into the $700 to $750 range per thousand board feet, that meant more than $10,000 extra for buyers. In a market already strained by high interest rates and limited supply, that kind of increase doesn't just hurt, it pushes the dream of homeownership further out of reach. Across states like Texas, Florida, and Ohio, builders suddenly found themselves trapped, material costs rising faster than they could adjust, forcing delays, redesigns, and in some cases, complete project cancellations. Budgets that were locked months earlier no longer made sense, turning profitable plans into financial risks. And the impact didn't stop at homebuyers. It spread into rent, renovations, and even infrastructure, quietly pushing up the overall cost of living. At the same time, the expected boom in U.S. forestry jobs never fully arrived, because tariffs alone couldn't fix deeper problems like outdated mills, higher operating costs, and limited timber access compared to Canada's vast government-managed forests. What followed was an even more complex battle. U.S. industry groups pushed harder, filing new complaints and subsidy allegations against Canadian producers, while Canada pushed back, rejecting the claims and continuing to adapt. By early 2026, Canadian companies had already paid around $7.7 billion in duties, but instead of retreating, they pivoted. They expanded into global markets, strengthened export routes through ports like Vancouver and Prince Rupert, and increased shipments to countries like Japan, South Korea, and across Europe. Demand followed. Japan alone boosted imports by over 25% in some periods, while emerging markets in Asia and the Middle East opened new doors. And this is where the story truly shifts. Canada didn't just sell more lumber, it moved up the value chain, investing in advanced materials like cross-laminated timber and positioning wood as a low-carbon alternative to steel. In a world focused on sustainability, that strategy turned a trade conflict into a long-term advantage, with exports beyond the U.S. rising nearly 20% by 2025, and companies doubling down on global expansion instead of looking back. What started as a policy shift has now begun to reshape the entire industry. But inside the United States, the impact didn't explode in headlines. It built slowly, quietly, and relentlessly. Because housing isn't just another sector, it's a foundation of the entire economy. And when it slows, everything feels it. Jobs, growth, stability. Economists are now acknowledging the gap between intention and reality. Instead of boosting domestic production, tariffs created bottlenecks, raised costs, and pushed affordability further out of reach, acting less like a shield and more like a drag on the system. And the irony is hard to miss. The very policy meant to weaken Canada's position has in many ways strengthened it. Higher global prices, diversified markets, and greater resilience. Meanwhile, the U.S. hasn't eliminated dependence. It's made it more expensive and less predictable, turning supply chains into a more fragile and costly system. The price of independence is no longer theoretical, it's measurable. And yet the debate continues, because policies like this don't get reversed overnight.
They reshape the landscape, forcing both sides to adapt to a new reality. And that brings us back to the real question. This was never just about lumber.
It was about strategy, about how deeply connected modern economies really are. Because when one country pulls away, the effects don't stay contained, they ripple outward, creating new opportunities elsewhere. The data already tells us the US still needs Canadian lumber. So now the real choice is this: double down on protection or find a smarter balance with the realities of supply and demand. And for Canada, the challenge is just as big. Can it sustain this momentum and truly become a global leader in sustainable building materials? Because what we're watching isn't just a trade dispute, it's a shift in economic gravity, a reminder that decisions made at the top don't stay there. They move through industries, markets, and into everyday life. So the real question is simple. Did this strategy protect American industry, or did it hand Canada the advantage? If this breakdown helped you see what's really happening behind the headlines, subscribe for more deep dives like this. And tell me, should the US rethink its path or push forward no matter the cost?